Greetings and salutations. Thank you for lending an ear to the Voice of the Times for Friday, July 29, 2022. For today's editorial, Freeing Myanmar People from the Yoke of Tyranny. The military rulers of Myanmar announced early this week the execution of 4 democracy activists for quote-unquote acts of terrorism. The carrying out of the death sentences opens a new chapter in Myanmar's continuing saga of brutal repression and has sparked a wave of outrage across the world. That doesn't seem to perturb the military junta, which has, throughout its decades-long rule, survived broadsides of international condemnation unscathed. In February last year, General Min Aung Hlaing, the junta's leader, reimposed military rule and ousted the caretaker government of Aung San Suu Kyi on charges of election fraud. In the sweeping crackdown on dissent that followed, thousands of civilians were arrested, and the United Nations has estimated that more than 1,000 were killed as soldiers used guns, batons, and tear gas to disperse street protests. Hlaing declared himself Prime Minister and promised to hold elections by 2023. His assurance of a return to normalcy did not impress the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, which decided to bar him from the summit of the regional bloc's leaders. Now Myanmar's leadership is thumbing its nose once more at critics by announcing the executions, clearly relishing its reputation as the bad boy of the Southeast Asian region. The execution of the 4 dissidents may not be the last. Close to 120 death sentences are believed to have been handed down by military-controlled courts since last year's coup. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has strongly condemned the executions and called again for the release of all detained prisoners, including Suu Kyi. The European Union, Australia, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Korea, Britain, and the United States jointly denounced the executions as open-quote reprehensible acts of violence that further exemplify the regime's disregard for human rights and the rule of law, close quote. For Amnesty International, it was quote-unquote an enormous setback and warned that the junta is quote-unquote not going to stop there. Condemnation alone will not stop the rule of repression in Myanmar. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Myanmar, Tom Andrews, is urging the Security Council to, open quote, pass a strong resolution of not only condemnation but clear strategic action, sanctions, economic sanctions, and arms embargo, close quote. The U.S. State Department has said Washington was crafting its own response to the Myanmar situation and, quote-unquote, all options were being considered. The options could also include a ban on the sale of oil and gas supplies to Myanmar. Sadly, ASEAN appears to be averse to dealing more assertively with its erring member. Some ASEAN states have even recommended, open quote, that ASEAN give space to Myanmar to restore its internal affairs and return to normalcy, close quote. Following the military coup last year, ASEAN came up with a quote-unquote 5-point consensus for restoring peace in Myanmar. It called for an immediate stop to the violence, constructive dialogue among all parties, assigning a special ASEAN envoy to facilitate mediation, providing humanitarian aid, and sending a delegation to Myanmar to meet with all parties concerned. Hlaing's response to the proposals was inscrutable. He, open quote, was not opposed to ASEAN playing a constructive role or an ASEAN delegation visit or humanitarian assistance, close quote, according to Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, who presented the proposals to the Myanmar strongman. But Hlaing was lukewarm to the call for an end to the violence, perhaps believing that doing so could be interpreted as a sign of weakness. The failure to fully agree to the consensus led to the ASEAN decision to not invite Hlaing to the Leaders' Summit. Other than the snub, the group was wary about dealing with Hlaing more forcefully. This reluctance must end. ASEAN's charter requires its member states to, open quote, strengthen democracy, enhance good governance and the rule of law, and to promote and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms, close quote. Myanmar's military regime is clearly in violation of that principle. The Philippines must take the lead in convincing the ASEAN leadership to take a more vigorous stance in freeing Myanmar and its people from the yoke of tyranny. And that's the editorial for Friday, July 29, 2022. For more news and information, get a copy of the Manila Times on print, subscribe to its digital edition, or log on to www.manilatimes.net. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, and listen to the Voice of the Times.
Our longest trusted English newspaper since 1898. Now available digitally. Computer. Order the Manila Times Digital Edition. Subscribed. Get the Manila Times Digital Edition for less than 2 pesos and 50 centavos per day when you sign up for 1 year. The Manila Times, news source of choice, trusted since 1898.